Hello and welcome to another tier list video. Today we are taking a look at Risk of Rain 1 items part 2. If you haven't already seen my part 1 video, take a look at that one. I go over the common and the uncommon items. This one I'm going to be looking at the active items, the rare items, and the boss items. So starting us off, we're going to be first looking at the active items. The first one is the Disposable Missile Launcher. Now this one, basically, when you activate it, it just shoots, a bunch like 8, 10, 12 missiles at enemies nearby. Overall, this one's pretty solid, pretty useful, especially if you're in a melee character and there's an enemy at another platform that you're having a hard time reaching. It's pretty good because the missiles are lock-on. So overall, really no complaints about this one. It's not insane, but it has a pretty low cooldown, good damage. Overall, just a consistent item, so going to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Drone Repair Kit. Now, this item, does exactly what it sounds like. It repairs all your drones that you're using to full health. Of course, this item is really only useful if you're going for a drone build and you have a lot of drones. That being said, it definitely is really helpful because when your drones do die, it can be kind of expensive to be buying them back. So if you are going for a drone build, this is one of the best items you can have. That being said, I'm not one who goes for drone builds very often, so I think that it's a relatively weak item outside of that because if you don't have drones, this item is completely useless. So for that reason, it's going to find itself only in the C tier. Up next, we have the Timekeepers stopwatch. This item basically freezes time, I believe, for 7 seconds. And overall, I think this is just a pretty good item. It's like a much better version of the stopwatch active item that only activates when you get to low health. This is pretty nice because you can activate it whenever, if you're in a really tough spot, if you're getting low on health, fighting a boss. Especially those magma worms, if they're coming out of the ground, you can freeze time and pretty much just wail on them for 7 seconds. So definitely a pretty strong item, going to find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have the Captain's Brooch. This basically just calls down a chest near you. And overall, I would say this is a really good item later on in the game, especially if you get the rare item that lowers your cooldown or gives you a chance of activating double. You can get double chests and the cooldown is shorter. Early game this isn't quite as good because usually you can't even afford to open all the chests on a level, so getting more chests isn't really going to help you that much. That being said, in the late game, this is one of my favorite items. You can really snowball, get a lot of items with it, especially if you have gold generation. So Captain's Brooch going to be in the S tier for me. Anything that generates more items, I'm always a big fan of. Up next, we have the Carnera Marble. Now, I believe that's how it's pronounced. Basically, you use this item once, and then you use it again, and it'll spawn a portal that kind of connects two parts of the map that you can return through once. And this is really a pretty good one. If you find the portal early on in the level, you can place it down at the portal, and then, clear the rest of the level, pick up all the chests, and then activate it again to teleport yourself back to the portal. So this one can really save you a lot of time if you're not very quick, you don't have good movement. So this is one I really like to have in the earlier levels when I don't have any Pulse, Goat Hoof, or Hapu Feathers to navigate easily. So this one definitely can help save you some time and get to those later levels even quicker. So overall, a pretty strong one in the early game. That being said, as the game goes on, this one becomes less and less useful, but overall, it's still pretty good. Doesn't help you kill enemies, but the fact that it helps you progress levels early on quicker is a pretty big plus for me, and that's enough for it to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have prescriptions, aka steroids, as we call them. This basically gives you increased attack speed for, I believe, 7 seconds. And overall, this is just a really good one. It's a really big jump to your DPS boost, especially on certain characters who really excel with good attack speed. People like Huntress, Chef, Commando come to mind. It's definitely a really good use item on those characters. That being said, on other characters, things like Mercenary, Handy, even Miner, it's not quite as good to get that attack speed. Not really as necessary, but overall, still a solid item, and for me, good enough to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Pillaged Gold, which I believe when you activate it, it makes any enemies that are on screen drop extra money when you kill them. This one, it can be useful in the early game when you're struggling to get a lot of money to open all the chests on a level. That being said, it's really not that great, and it doesn't even give you very much extra gold. I'm not sure exactly how the amount is calculated for how much the monsters drop extra, but I know it's not a lot, and it's really not that significant. For me, this is one of the worst items to pick up. Definitely going to be in the D tier. Up next, we have the Crudely Drawn Buddy, I believe. Crudely Drawn Buddy, Crudely Drawn Friend, one of those two. This one basically spawns a little decoy of your character. It looks kind of goofy, kind of cute, honestly. And basically enemies attack it for 8 to 10 seconds. I'm not sure exactly how long it spawns for, but overall, this one can be kind of useful if you have a ton of enemies chasing after you and you're low health. You can drop this down, give yourself a chance to get away, but overall, it's really not the best, not super necessary to use. Overall, pretty mediocre, pretty niche, gonna find itself in the C tier as well. Up next, we have the Rotten Brain. This one it is super underwhelming. Basically, you call down a bouncing brain and it just sits there bouncing up and down for like 10 seconds, dealing pretty minimal damage, honestly. That being said, I love picking this one up. I love the sound it makes. I love how it looks when it's bouncing, so just because it's got a special place in my heart, Rotten Brain gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have Snow Globe, which basically turns the map into a blizzard for like 10 seconds, and enemies have a chance to freeze for, I think, 3 seconds. Overall, this one is okay, but, you know, it's really not the best because you can't really control which enemies get frozen, so it's kind of just an escape mechanism. If you have a lot of enemies chasing you, you know, you can call this down and freeze some of the enemies. Give yourself a little bit of chance to fight some enemies one at a time, maybe, but overall, it's a pretty mediocre item. Gonna find itself in the C tier as well. Up next, we have the Buzzsaw. This basically shoots the Buzzsaw forward and then comes back to you. Overall, this one is pretty good, deals good damage. If you have a lot of enemies in a row, this is one of the best used items to have, because you can just deal a lot of damage, take out a lot of enemies really quickly. So overall, I would say this one is pretty good, and it has a very low cooldown, so it's got that going for it as well. It's gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Foreign Fruit. This basically just heals you. It's not a lot of healing, but it can save you sometimes in a pinch, and the cooldown is really low, so picking this one up, it's not the best, but it still feels pretty good, and does give you a bit more survivability, because it feels so good just to use it all the time with such a low cooldown. So Foreign Fruit, while it's not super impactful, it definitely has its use cases, so it's going to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Backup, which basically calls in 4 of the, you know, default standard drones around you, and this one I would say is pretty good. You know, especially in the early game, having those 4 drones can add a lot of DPS. You can really take down bosses really quickly if you have those drones, so I would say this one is pretty good. It does fall off a little bit in the late game, when the drones aren't quite as impactful for how much health the enemies have. That being said, this is still a solid choice, still a solid use item, and not too long of a cooldown. And if you do have the Arms Race item, I believe the Backup also has a chance to shoot rockets, so if you have a couple of those, even if you don't have drones, this used item can help you make use of that. So pretty good use item overall, gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have the Shield Generator. Now this thing makes you invincible for 7 seconds, I think. Honestly, a super good item, one of the best used items for sure. Invincibility is huge, you know, especially when you're fighting like Magmorms, especially. Those can be a menace, and having invincibility, especially as a melee character, just helps you be able to walk up to them and wail on them. Definitely a really strong item, gonna find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have the Squib. I absolutely love this item. I love saying it. I love the way it looks. When you use this item, it basically creates almost a shotgun spread of little like jellyfish or squids, whatever they are, and sends them in a straight line across. And this one, especially if you're using it against a boss, you can completely knock them out. It does so much damage. It's a short cooldown. Absolutely love this item. As far as offensive items go, it is by far my favorite one to use. Gonna be in the S tier. Up next, we have the Giant Amethyst. Now this item, it's not the best, but it's okay. It resets all your cooldowns, which is pretty good, especially on some characters who have pretty significant cooldowns. I'm somebody who plays a lot of Mercenary and Huntress, so those cooldowns really aren't that long to begin with, so this item is really not the best, but that being said, it is a pretty short cooldown. And especially if you're playing a character that has a dodge ability, being able to reset that and use that back-to-back can be pretty handy, so it's a decent item, but overall it's not the best. Really the only reason it's even somewhat viable is because it does have a very low cooldown, so for me that's going to be good enough to find it in the B tier. Up next, we have the Skeleton Key. Now this opens all chests on screen, which is really good, especially if you can find a part of the map where there's like a lot of chests. I mean, you get this early on and you find a part of the map that has a lot of chests, you can really snowball, get a lot of items early for free. Definitely a super good item, not quite as useful in the late game when you're making so much money that you don't really need this. That being said, it is one of the best items to have in the early game. Really strong, gonna find itself in the S tier. Even though it's not great late game, it is just the best item to get in the early game, so for that reason, gotta find it in the S tier. Up next, we have the Magic Mirror. Now this basically creates a mirror image of your character, and basically they do everything that you do, so it pretty much just doubles all of your damage output. Overall, it's really pretty good, helps you deal a lot of damage, especially if you're already dealing a lot. You can really shred through bosses. So overall, just a pretty solid item, gives you a huge DPS boost, gonna find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have the Androna Blanket, the name something lantern. Basically, it drops a lantern that fears enemies away and damages them. So, you know, if you're in a tight spot, you can drop this down and pretty much stand on that, and most enemies won't be able to get to you. So, it's pretty good, decent, but not the best because the lantern just kind of sits there and it's not a huge area. So, overall, can be good, but it's relatively niche, so it's going to find itself in the C tier. Up next, we have the Instant Minefield, which basically when you use it, it just drops a bunch of mines underneath you and damages the enemies when they walk over them. It deals pretty good damage, but overall, it's not the best, relatively niche, only going to find itself in the C tier. Up next, we have the Dynamite Plunger. This basically, when you hit enemies, they drop dynamite, and then you can activate the Dynamite Plunger to blow them up. Overall, this one, it's a little more useful than the Instant Minefield, but overall, not the best, not quite strong enough to find itself in the B tier, because I believe it's a pretty long cooldown as well, so gonna find itself in a solid C tier. Up next, we have the Jar of Souls, which basically creates a ghost of every single enemy on the screen, and the ghosts will attack enemies. This is not an item I like to use in the late game, because if there's a ton of enemies on screen, you can kind of lag your game a little bit and potentially even crash. So for that reason, Jar of Souls is going to find itself in the D tier. It's good in the early game, but in the late game, you don't want to use it if you're worried about crashing. So up next, we have Glowing Meteorite, which is a bit of a meme item among me and my friends. This item basically calls down a bunch of meteorites all over the screen for like 10-15 seconds, but it can damage you and your teammates. So if you have teammates, call this one in just to piss them off. Just kidding. I love using this item though. It's pretty fun. It deals okay damage, but it's more so just used as a joke item to upset your friend if they take an item that you wanted. Just call in a glowing meteorite to get back at them. So honestly, as far as killing enemies, it's not the best, but its use against your friends, pretty strong. Gonna find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have the Gold-Plated Bomb. This removes half your money and drops a bomb that deals damage for however much money you lost. I'll be honest, even in the late game when you have a ton of money, this item is still usually pretty underwhelming, and the damage it deals for the money you lose is never worth it. Definitely going to be in the F tier for me. Up next, we have Massive Leech, which basically, I believe you heal 10 health every time you damage an enemy, so this one I would say is pretty good. If you have a lot of attack speed especially, this is a pretty good used item. Can give you a lot of healing if you don't have other healing items, so I will say this one is pretty good, but once you have enough healing items, it's really kind of obsolete, but overall still pretty solid. Gonna find itself in a solid C tier. Up next, we have the Old Doll. I don't think that's the exact correct name, but basically it damages you and then you damage an enemy in return. This is another one where it's relatively useless in my opinion. Even if you have a lot of health, the damage it deals is still not that significant. And as somebody who plays on glass mode, usually when I pick up this item, I don't have like hardly any health, so it's really useless. So this item, honestly, gonna be another F tier. Well, that's all of the used items. Now we're gonna be jumping into the rare items. And starting us off, we have Alien Head. And Alien Head reduces all of your cooldowns by 25%, and I believe when you pick up 3 of them, it caps out at 60%, which is super good because 60% cooldown reduction is really significant on every single character. This item really feels good to use. Now, rare items, of course, they're the best in the game. You can imagine a lot of these are going to be pretty highly ranked, and Alien Head is no different. Going to be in the S tier. Cooldown reduction just always feels great. Up next, we have the Ancient Scepter, which upgrades your ultimate ability. This is a lot of people's favorite item in the game, and it is probably my favorite item in the game as well. Upgrading your ultimate ability just feels so good, and there's really nobody who has a bad ultimate ability when it's upgraded. I'm a huge Mercenary fan, and Mercenary ultimate ability is just fantastic. Ancient Scepter just feels great to pick up every single time. Gotta be an S tier for me. Up next, we have the ATG Mark 2 or 3. If the first one is 1, then this one is 2. If the first one's 2, this one's 3. I'm not quite sure which mark it is. But the ATG Missile Launcher for the rare item basically is the same as the green item that looks exactly the same. But this one has more damage and I believe a higher % chance to proc. and I believe the missiles might even have a longer range as well for locking on. Overall, this one is decent, but it's not going to blow you away. It's just a solid item. Going to be in the B tier for me. Up next, we have Beating Embryo, which gives you a chance to double proc your active item. So this one can be really good if you have a good active item that benefits from the double proc. That being said, not all active items really benefit that much from double proc. However, some of them are pretty good. You know, things like the Captain's Brooch, which can call on multiple chests, always feels really good. Things like Bouncing Brain, no, that one's not that good. But this one, it's a pretty good rare item. That being said, it's heavily dependent on which active item you have. So for that reason, it's only going to find itself in the B tier. It would be much higher if you were guaranteed to have a great active item, but it's kind of dependent. Up next, we have the Brilliant Behemoth, which basically makes all of your attacks have an explosion that happens. And this one is really, really good on certain characters. Others, it's not quite as good. That being said, you know, somebody who has fast attack speed, I think is really good. Like if you're playing Huntress or Commando with high attack speed, or even Chef with high attack speed, you were just throwing out your attacks and making everything blow up. It's good on everybody, but it is really, really good on some characters, and is definitely going to be a very solid A tier for me. Up next, we have Ceremonial Dagger, which, especially in glass mode, which I play on pretty much primarily, this thing is absolutely insane. When you kill an enemy, it spawns different, you know, purple daggers in the air, and they seek towards other enemies, and when it kills them, it spawns even more. So this thing you can really snowball with, super, super strong. In terms of, you know, damage output and killing a lot of enemies, this is probably the best rare item in the game. Definitely going to be in the S tier. Up next, we have Dios Friend. This thing, not a fan, honestly. It basically gives you a revive when you die. And it's single time use until you pick up another one. So really not a huge fan of this one, because sure, it can be nice when you do end up dying to have that revive. That being said, it just feels really underwhelming, because if you don't die, this is a completely wasted item, and every time I pick this one up, I think this could have been another good rare item. So Dios Friend, honestly, not really a huge fan. Can save you sometimes, so it'll find itself in the D tier, but really not a fan of that one. Up next, we have the Fireman's Boot, which basically, everywhere you go, it sends like a fire in your path behind you, so you can pretty much, you know, run around, and then when enemies walk over the fire, they take damage. It's okay, it's not super good, it doesn't deal a ton of damage. As far as rare items go, it's pretty middle of the road, and for that reason, it'll find itself in the C tier. Up next, we have Haunting Mask, which makes it so when you kill an enemy, it has a chance to spawn an enemy ghost that'll attack enemies for, you know, X amount of time. Similar to Jar of Souls, this is not an item you want to pick up in the late game, because if you pick it up and you're killing, you know, hundreds of enemies a level, you're spawning hundreds of ghosts, you will make your game lag, and I have had times where I picked up this item and it has resulted in my game crashing because there's just so many ghosts on the map. So for that reason, honestly, it's got to be in the F tier, because I actually just do not pick up this item. Even though I don't like Dios Friend, I'll still pick it up, but Haunting Mask I actually will not pick up for the sake of my game's performance. Up next, we have Heaven Cracker, which makes it so that every 4 attacks, you pretty much shoot this little bolt right in front of you. It's pretty short range, but can be useful. If you have a lot of attack speed, you can proc it pretty often, and it does deal good damage. So Heaven Cracker, pretty solid, but limited in its application, so going to find itself in the C tier as far as rare items go. Up next, we have the Hyper Threader, which makes it so every time you attack something, it shoots a laser that bounces to 2 other enemies. And if you have high attack speed, I mean, you're just shooting lasers all over the place. This is a really, really good item that synergizes incredibly well with high attack speed, so definitely going to find itself in the A tier. Very solid A tier, close to S tier, but just not quite there. Up next, we have, I believe, Forbidden Fruit. Another kind of meme rare item. Not super good. Basically, when you pick this item up, there's a chance that, you know, fruit will spawn on different places on the map that'll heal you. That being said, the healing isn't super great. It can save you sometimes, but as far as rare items go, pretty underwhelming. Gonna find itself in the D tier. Up next, we have Laser Turbine. Now this basically, every time you attack, it charges up the laser, and then when it gets to full power, it shoots a laser basically wherever your character is, just a laser horizontally across the map. and this thing deals a crap ton of damage. You can kill pretty much any enemy that's not a boss in one shot when you have this thing charged up. Super strong, and once again, if you have high attack speed, it means you can charge it up really fast and proc this thing very often. Definitely a really strong rare item for sure. Gonna be in the S tier for me. Up next we have Old Box, which honestly, another item, not a huge fan of it. It only activates when you're at low health, and basically when you do get to low health, it drops a little black hole type thing that fears away and damages enemies, kind of similar to the Lantern active. So not a huge fan. I don't like things that activate when I'm at low health, so gonna be another D tier for that one. Up next we have Permafrost. Now this item is decent. When you damage enemies, it has a chance to stun them and then slow them afterwards. The slowing effect, I can take it or leave it, really not that useful, but the stunning effect is kind of useful. That being said, it's not a super high chance and not a super long stun duration, so it's useful, but doesn't feel great compared to other rare items. Gonna find itself in the C tier. Up next we have the Photon Jetpack, which, as you can imagine, helps you fly. You know, when you pick up this item, you get a little jetpack power supply thing next to your character, and you can see how long you can fly for, and after you land, it fills it back up. Really helpful for navigating, and if you pick this one up early, it can be really nice if you're a character who doesn't have an easy way to navigate. Can help you make some of those more difficult jumps for sure. So Photon Jetpack, pretty good item, gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next we have the Plasma Chain, which this item, when you damage enemies, it has a chance to attach the plasma chain to them, and basically just keeps that chain going and damages them over time until they die. Pretty strong item, helps you deal pretty good damage, you know, especially if you attach it to something like Magma Worm, which is hard to damage for a lot of characters. So, you know, you attach it to them and you're just going to be constantly damaging them until they're dead. So a pretty solid item overall, I would say, going to be a solid B tier. Up next we have Rapid Mitosis. This item reduces the cooldown of all your active items. This one, just like beating Embryo, heavily relies on, do you have a good active item? If you do, having a lower cooldown feels great. If you don't have a great active item, well, you know, you can take it or leave it. So it's a really strong item with the right active, but you got to have the right active item for it. So it's only going to find itself in the B tier. Would be higher if you were guaranteed to have a great item. Up next we have Repulsion Armor, which makes it so that when you take, I believe it's 6 attacks in a short amount of time, you basically start reflecting damage, and any damage you do take for, you know, 5 or 6 seconds is reduced as well. So a pretty good one, great on melee characters, really helps you stay nice and tanky. Overall, just a solid item for surviving, gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next we have Shattering Justice. This item makes it so that every time you damage an enemy, it reduces their armor up to a certain cap, unless you get more stacks. Overall, this one is pretty good, especially against those high armor targets that can take a long time to take down. So having at least one of these in your inventory is definitely pretty good. Gonna help you out quite a bit. Gonna find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have Telescopic Sight, which gives you, I believe, a 0.3% chance to instantly kill an enemy. Maybe it's a 1% chance. I'm not exactly sure where it starts at, but I know the max is 3% chance to kill an enemy. And overall, this one is pretty good because instantly killing an enemy is pretty good. That being said, as somebody who plays mostly in glass mode, late game, I'm instantly killing a lot of enemies, but it can be pretty good to have, like, you know, on mini bosses. Of course, the percent chance is pretty low, but when you do proc it, it feels pretty good. Overall, it's a solid item, but it's heavily RNG based, and for that reason, only going to find itself in the C tier for me. Up next, we have Tesla Coil, which is a great item for melee characters. Basically creates a electric field around you that damages and bounces to enemies when you get close to them. Pretty much a super powerful barbed wire. Feels super good to pick up on melee characters, especially. Gonna find itself in the A tier. Up next we have Thallium, which when you damage a enemy, there's a chance that you, I guess, infect them with Thallium or contaminate them with Thallium. And basically they take a bunch of damage over time. Really a pretty strong item, can deal a lot of damage if you are able to contaminate a boss with Thallium. So overall it's pretty solid, but I believe you can only infect one person at a time, and it's a relatively low chance, so it's only going to find itself in the B tier for that. Up next we have a hit list, which basically occasionally marks enemy targets, and when you kill those targets you permanently increase your damage. I just cap out at, I believe, 15 or 30% damage boost, but overall you pick up one of these and it's free damage increase, so really hard to complain about this one. Gonna be in the A tier. Up next, we have the old Lopper. This basically gives you a, actually not a chance, it gives you a guaranteed critical strike against enemies that are below 9% health. And if you stack these up enough, I believe it caps out at 35%, so pretty good if you don't already have a lot of other crit items. Getting those guaranteed crits on lower health enemies is a good way to finish them off, so pretty strong. But you know, once you get to a point in the game where you're already at max crit chance, this item becomes pretty irrelevant, so for that reason, only going to find itself in the C tier. Up next, we have the final rare item, which is the Alien Ring, which critical strikes reduce your cooldowns by 1 second, which is super good, especially if you're playing on a character who has a lot of attacks that can attack really fast and you got a lot of crit chance. Your cooldowns are coming off like instantly when you use them, so feels super good. Definitely going to be an S tier for me. Reducing your cooldowns of your abilities always feels great, and if you have the crit chance, this item is pretty much unbeatable. Up next, we have the boss items, and starting us off, we have Ifrits Horn, which gives you a 8% chance to incinerate enemies on screen, which basically just deals a bunch of damage to a specific enemy. Pretty low chance to proc, so it is, you know, not insane, but overall, a lot of these boss items are relatively niche, I would say, but this one, it's pretty good. Gives you a bit of extra damage, gives you a bit more, you know, enemy killing potential, but overall, it's not the best. Only going to find itself in the C tier for me. Up next, we have a Legendary Spark, which is actually really similar to Ifrit's Horn. It is also an 8% chance to smite an enemy on screen. Once again, it's decent, but it's not the best. Helps you kill enemies a little bit quicker, but overall, going to find itself right alongside Ifrit's Horn. Up next, we have Burning Agony, which I would say is probably one of the better boss items in my opinion. When you kill an enemy, it gives you a little bit of damage boost, a little bit of move speed boost, and then also makes a trail of fire follow behind you, kind of like the Fireman's Boot. So this one I would say is pretty good, especially the damage increase and the move speed increase on enemy killing is really nice. Gonna find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have the Imps Tail. This thing, I really like this one. It's not the best, but I just think it's cool because when you pick this one up, you get an imp that follows you around and basically attacks enemies, and if he dies, he respawns after 60 seconds. Overall, I like this one. He's not super helpful, but it's just kind of cool having a companion. I'm always quite sentimental about having companions in games, so definitely going to be an A tier for me. Up next, we have Colossus Neural, which is a really good tank item. It gives you everything you want. It gives you health, gives you armor, and it gives you regen. If you're a melee character who's going for more of a tanky build, this is probably the best boss item you can pick up. Definitely a solid choice. Never really feels bad to pick this one up. Gonna be in the A tier. Up next, we have the Nematocist Nozzle. Now, this thing is actually an active item, but it is dropped from the jellyfish, and basically, when you activate it, it does what the jellyfish does, where it spawns a bunch of little circles around and then sends them flying towards the nearest enemy. Overall, it's pretty good damage, and it's a really short cooldown. I think it's only like 30 seconds, so as far as active items go, I think this one is really strong. Definitely going to be an S tier for me, just because it's an active item, and good damage and low cooldown, so that's really all I can ask for. Last, and maybe least, is the white t-shirt. This item drops from the hidden level. If you don't know about that one, check it out. I think it's Boar's Beach, I believe is what it's called. And this is the item drop you get from the boss there. This thing, it's kind of cool to pick it up, but I think as far as the stats go, it only gives you 3 armor, so really pretty underwhelming, but, you know, it's cool to pick up, but 3 armor is, you know, it's not much. Gonna be in the D tier for me. Well, that's my list. Let me know your guys' thoughts, and I hope you enjoyed.